Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Genetics in the News. And this episode was prompted by the reports in the newspapers this morning that the actress Angelina Jolie had announced that she had had a double mastectomy. And this is, of course, all over the newspapers now. So, Angelina Jolie announced today she decided to have both of her healthy breasts removed. And this is because she has a very high risk of breast cancer, because she has a mutant allele of the BRCA1 gene. Now, cancer is a collection of diseases, not a single disease, caused by mutations in somatic cells. These are the cells of our body that don't give rise to eggs and sperm, which is, say, almost all the cells of our body. And mutations occur in these cells very commonly as the cells divide to form our body, but usually they don't cause any problems, either because the mutations are harmful to the cell and the cell dies, or because the mutations don't really affect the cell's behavior. The mutations become a problem when they benefit the cell. Note that I said the mutations benefit the cell, not the person. Mutations that increase the cell's likelihood of growing and dividing, even when it shouldn't, are the ones that cause real problems. Now, the BRCA1 and 2 genes, there's 2 genes, both of which cause the same sorts of problems. They do essentially components of the same job. They both code for proteins that control cell growth by blocking cell growth when the DNA is damaged. And if this control fails, then cells with DNA damage keep growing and dividing, and they accumulate more and more mutations as they grow and become better and better at ignoring signals that tell them they should stop growing. Now, normally we inherit 2 functional copies of the BRCA1 gene. That's the gene that's mutant in Angelina Jolie, as we inherit 2 functional copies of all our genes, one from mom and one from dad. The BRCA1 gene's job is to produce a protein that controls cell growth. If we inherit one defective copy of this gene, it doesn't really cause any immediate problems for our cells because we still have one functional copy and it still makes enough of the signals of the molecules involved in controlling damage and regulating growth. But if one of the cells in our body, a cell in particular in our breast, undergoes a second mutation so that it's now lost the function of its second BRCA1 gene, then the cell is no longer able to prevent damaged cells from growing. These cells keep growing, they accumulate more damage and more mutations, and their descendants get more and more mutations in the genes that control cell growth, until eventually we get uncontrolled cell growth and other behaviors typical of cancer cells. Now, the risks of this happening are quite high, not because the mutation rate in our somatic cells is that high, but because there are so very many somatic cells in even a single modest-sized breast. And this means that the risk of breast cancer is greatly increased by having one functional copy of the gene and one defective copy. It goes from less than 1% risk of breast cancer by age 50 in normal women to 50% in women with who are born with one defective allele, and to over 80% risk by age 70. The risk of getting cancer in a second breast after you've had cancer in one breast is also increased, and the risk of ovarian cancer is also greatly increased by mutations in these genes. Now, the test that Angelina Jolie would have taken is one provided by a company called Myriad Genetics, and they advertise their tests to physicians and to genetics counselors, encouraging them to have their patients tested by having their BRCA1 and 2 genes sequenced to determine if they carry any mutations. Now, there are serious legal and ethical problems with the test. The test is done very well. It's a very competent and important test. The problem is that about 15 years ago, Myriad Genetics was granted a patent, not just on the test, but a patent on the genes themselves. And this means that nobody else in the United States, at least, is allowed to offer this test. As of 2013, Myriad Genetics still charges about $3,000 for each test, even though the cost of DNA sequencing has fallen by more than 1,000-fold in the last few years. If it wasn't patented, it would be far more inexpensive, accessible to a lot more people who need it. In fact, the major risk alleles are included in 23andMe's $99 genome analysis. So many physicians and geneticists and scientists think that these patents should be thrown out of court. And they've been working their way through the legal system, first being overturned, then reinstated. And now these patents are in front of the United States Supreme Court, and we can expect a decision next month. Now, you're probably thinking, should I get tested? Should I take this expensive test or the cheap 23andMe test? Well, there are several considerations. Two are scientific. The first is, if you're of Ashkenazi Jewish descent, you may indeed want to be tested because defective BRCA1 and BRCA2 alleles are common in these populations. If you are from a family that has a strong history of breast cancer, either on your mother's side or on your father's side, you may also want to get tested. But before you get tested, you also need to think about the personal and social consequences. You need to think about, what are you going to do if it is bad news? And you need to think about how this news will affect other people, because genetics is always a family affair. And if you were to test positive, this has strong implications for the risks borne by your mother, your sisters, and your daughters, and even the men in your family, because BRCA mutations also increase the risk of breast cancer in men. So those are issues you need to think about. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this Genetics in the News, and I'll get back to you with some more as soon as another nice genetic story comes up.